Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from in Canada. Welcome to the Climate Connections. Today is an exciting session on the topic of power. So welcome everyone. Before we start, it's with gratitude and respect I acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Calgary, which is within the Treaty 7 territory. These are the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. I encourage everyone here to add your land acknowledgements in the chat before we proceed. And for those who are first time into the Climate Connections, this is a problem-driven event series that connects solution seekers from industry with researchers and innovators from academia and fosters cross-sector connections to address the climate challenge. This series brings together industry experts who present short reverse pitches on the challenges they see. Through structured conversations with academic researchers, innovators, and entrepreneurs, we unpack and explore their challenges and hope to spark ideas and connections among the audience. So in this group, we have our Helix 5 model represented through our panelists and audience members. So thank you all for joining us. So a quick run through our agenda. We'll start with a round of introductions. So we have an industry experts panel here who would share their views on the topic challenges to a net zero grid. The last 20-25 minutes, we would have a moderated Q&A, and then we would end with some concluding remarks. So feel free to add in any questions you have during the presentation in the chat so we can all address it during the session. So for anyone who's new to Foresight, Foresight Canada is Canada's clean tech accelerator. Our goal is to make Canada the first G7 country to reach net zero. So we follow the Helix model where we bring the innovators, industry, investors, academia, and the government and facilitate the conversations to help us work through the climate challenge together. So we focus on 5 main areas. We have the accelerator programs for clean tech ventures across the different developmental stages, starting from ideation all the way to companies that are in their commercialization and growth stage. We do innovation challenges with industry partners that want to improve their processes or reduce their environmental impact. We work with companies on their capital attraction journey through the investor readiness program, and we also have investor matchmaking program called the Access to Capital to help them through their fundraising journey. Then we work with companies that are basically Canadian innovations that have a global market through the Export Development Program. And finally, we create ecosystems in which clean tech can thrive, connecting the stakeholders in the sector. So I want to thank our partners in this event. We are proud of our academic partners we have in this event. We are very excited to be engaging with the thousands of researchers across organizations. These institutions represent over 100,000 students and tens of millions of dollars in equipment that we need as part of our transition. So I'd like to thank them for helping us have a full room today. So thanks to Entrepreneurship at UBC, Simon Fraser University, University of Victoria Impact Investing Hub, and McMaster University. With this, I'd like to pass it over to our lovely moderator, Peter Love, who's been instrumental in the PowerNext program itself, who's an industry veteran with over 40 years of experience in the power sector. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Thank you very much, Aditi, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here and to moderate this panel. So the focus of today's discussion is challenges to a net zero carbon grid by 2035. It's one of those big, hairy, outlandish ideas that's been talked about, discussed, and it's a huge challenge, and we all know that. And how we get there, or as close as we can to that, is going to be really important. So we've got 2 people who are going to be starting off the discussion with us to give us their insights into this issue of a net zero carbon grid. And I'm not to, I'm sure that we'll get into this, but obviously our grid is going to have to expand as decarbonization of our transportation and built environment is necessary in order to meet our carbon goals and carbon targets. So the grid is large now, and it's going to have to get a lot larger, and it's going to have to be clean. So it is a huge challenge. So our first speaker is, so we're glad to have, is Jay Wilson, who's the Director of Net Zero and Electrification at the Association of Electricity Canada, which maybe he'll talk to you a little bit about. He's worked on the interface of energy and climate policy for over a decade, and with various organizations. And he focuses on managing the risks and maximizing the opportunities for electricity companies during the transition to a low carbon, more electrified future. He advises startups and has an MSc in environmental applied science and management and an EMBA. And I'll just and I'll also now invite Jay to speak, and then after Jay's given his presentation, I'll do an introduction to Malcolm. So Jay, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks everybody for joining today. So I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, who so this is in Ottawa, Ontario, and the Algonquin and Anishinaabe have been here since time immemorial, and so of course I invite us all to consider where they are from, and in turn, where the land of Canada sort of came from, and how we came to be, and how we come to be here, and how we continue to live together in the future. On that note, I think the way that energy, especially electricity in Canada, works is very closely linked and going to be very even more linked to the Indigenous communities that are here in Canada and the Indigenous people that are here in Canada. Of course, we have a large country, and a lot of the electricity projects that are going to be built over the next 26 years as we get towards 2050 and are trying to reach our economy-wide goal of net zero emissions. A lot of those are going to involve the partnership with Indigenous communities, and so those relationships are really critical for our industry and for our overall goals as well. All right, so as Peter said in his wonderful introduction, so I'm the Director of Net Zero and Electrification at Electricity Canada. We are a trade association, and until I started working at one, I didn't really know what they did. So if you aren't sure what a trade association is, you're among friends. So we have members that are electricity companies. So our membership is national. We have members who generate, transmit, and distribute electricity to customers in every province and territory from coast to coast to coast. So if you got an electricity bill, I can almost guarantee you got it from one of my members, and sorry about that. But the reason we are located in Ottawa is because there's a lot of federal policy that does impact the electricity industry in Canada. Electricity is really a provincial creature. So in every province and territory, there is some version of a utility board or a public utilities commission, whose job it is to regulate the regulated utilities, amongst other things, in those provinces. So in BC, you have the BCUC, the BC Utilities Commission. In Ontario, here we have the Ontario Energy Board. There's one for each province. So they are the group that is in charge of ensuring that the natural monopolies that utilities aren't of monopoly power, and are providing affordable and reliable service, and as well as balancing that with a reasonable rate of return so that investors will continue to fund the improvements that need to be made to maintain and build out the system. That middle of the 20th century. And it has been certainly through changes, but the and sorry, I'm getting a note here that internet connection may be unstable. So if I lose you, then please let me know, and I will just go
We
back.
just lost you for about 2 or 3 seconds. It's okay.
Okay, perfect. Well, if it happens again, I'll turn off my video, and apologies, folks.
Okay.
So the utilities regulation is something that happens in each province. It's the job to ensure reliable and affordable service. At the federal level, of course, the federal government is responsible for interprovincial trade. So if power lines cross provincial borders, it is responsible for assessing impacts of major projects. So the Impact Assessment Acts and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada have a role. The federal government is responsible for fisheries. Canada generates a great deal, the majority of its electricity, through hydropower, and hydropower does have impacts on fish and fish habitat, and on fisheries. And so the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, federal level, is responsible for regulating those aspects of it. All in all, there's over 80 acts and regulations that impact the electricity sector federally, and there are more at the provincial level. When it comes to how the electricity sector will need to meet the interim 2035 net zero target and the overall supporting the overall economy-wide net zero 2050 target. So Peter mentioned, of course, that we're going to need more electricity. So that includes generation, of course. We will likely need to double and perhaps triple the amount of energy that is produced, electrical energy that's produced in Canada. And that, depending on the technologies that we choose to do that, that will mean between a doubling or a potentially much greater multiple of capacity to generate electricity. I'll return to that in a second. We also need to build long linear facilities, which are transmission lines, to probably both between provinces, but very much so within provinces. We're going to need to develop and invest in new technologies that we have not done before. And we need to do all of that in a way that keeps broader society on board. And generally, most people who are not who don't have director of net zero and electrification and work for an electricity trade association don't care that much about their electricity bill, except for what the number is. What is the number on that bill with a dollar sign in front of it? That is what people care most about. They do absolutely care about the environment. We know this. The reason I do what I do is because I'm an environmental scientist by training, and because I wanted to work somewhere where I could build towards a future that I could see benefiting the environment and aligning those values. People absolutely do care about the environment. We also know that the public at large is certainly right now, today, struggling to meet their economic needs, and as prices increase, support wanes for these for investments in things that are related to the environmental quality. That is unfortunate. If we are intending to expand the size of the electricity sector, it will require a great deal more investment, which means there will be rate impacts on it. There absolutely will be. In addition, we need to do things a lot more with a lot more consideration for the environment and for the social benefits that are shared with the communities that it impacts. And so that increases costs. The type of infrastructure that might have been able to be built in 1950, more corners could have been cut at that time than can be cut now. The types of not only inconveniences but impositions that communities might have tolerated or might have been imposed on a community in middle of the 20th century would not be tolerated today. So these are the trade-offs that we need to manage when we're talking about net zero. There are absolutely as well technical considerations that we need to take into account. Some of the technologies we need to reach net zero do not exist yet, or don't exist at commercial scale. So direct air capture if we're looking at the various modeling that's that's done to understand how do we get to net zero, right? How do we offset the emissions that we can't get to? Direct air capture is something that it's going to need to be there, but it is not quite there yet. Small modular nuclear reactors. So I think there's been a great deal of interest in those in many parts of the country, and including in parts of the country where are currently reliant on fossil fuels to generate their electricity or to provide heat for industrial processes. Small modular nuclear reactors provide an option to solve a few of those things with essentially little to no carbon emissions, but they are not there yet. And so number one, how can utilities and electricity companies plan based on the things that do not exist yet, that they can't say will be there on time? So how do we plan for that? Second, how do we do so while keeping rates affordable? And for us, that means not making them go up they will certainly go up, but not making them go up so rapidly that it causes economic hardship for Canadians in a way that undermines the transition that needs to happen. The third part is, how do we maintain reliability? There's lots of ways to generate electricity, but some are more reliable than others. And so if we are, if we're not building the types of generation, if we're not investing in the types of transmission and distribution technologies that are required in order to keep the electricity system reliable, then the value that people receive for the money they pay is going to be reduced, and so that will also undermine investment in things that are not seen as directly building the immediate value for Canadians. And the last bit is there are social and community considerations that have to be taken into account. So how do we build support for the types of infrastructure, the changes to the built environment and to the natural environment that may need to take place in order to realize the goal of being able to move a vast amount of power across the country to ensure that where it's generated can get to where it's needed, so that people can go about their lives, so that they can stay safe, and so that we can continue to do the types of things that we do. So the challenges that I focus on are primarily policy, because that is where I live, both literally and figuratively in Ottawa here, and primarily federal policy. The types of things that we think we need to happen from our point of view is this is not a status quo. We will continue to do the same things that we've always done, just maybe a little bit faster. This is an inflection point of significant proportions, and we need to do different things, and we need to do them differently. So the types of impact assessment that we've done in the past, the types of how we balance costs and benefits, those will not suit the type of massive investment that will be needed in order to meet these goals. If these goals are important, I would argue that they are critical to meet the net zero goals. Then we need to do things differently. We cannot have the same types of frankly, regulatory processes that have done before. We can't take 6 years or an indefinite period of time in order to come to a decision of whether or not to build something. So that doesn't mean we simply build everything. It doesn't mean we bulldoze concerns aside, but it does mean we need to, when it comes to paper process, that has to go at a very rapid pace, or else we simply will not meet the deadline. It will be difficult enough to engineer and build, to physically construct the things on time. We cannot add paper process on top of that. So when it comes to decision making, the decision makers need to make decisions, and they need to make them quickly. And so that's I think one of the biggest, most critical focuses it needs to be. If we can get that, then the investors that are looking to invest in electricity infrastructure will look look kindly upon that because it's it provides more certainty that there will be a return on their investment. And electricity companies will be able to build the types of infrastructure they need to build. So that's where we're looking in terms of where are the challenges and what are some potential solutions. And I know we've got folks in the audience today. I hope that you've got questions that you want to ask. And thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Jay, for that overview and your comments on the industry and the policy challenges. And I think you made it very clear we do need to find ways to do things differently. And we got to try different things and do things differently. So that's great. And please, those on the online, please begin to think about your questions. Next, I'd like to introduce Malcolm Metcalf. He's the technical lead of a group called IBET Climate. He'll talk to you a bit about that. He's got concerns about a clean grid by 2030, and he's going to talk about that. He's got 40 years of experience in energy and began as a hydro plant operator many years ago. He's been with BC Hydro. He's been with founded a company that I know called Enbala. He teaches at the UBC Okanagan campus and is quite involved in the energy systems debate. So Malcolm, I think you've got some slides, so over to you, and we'll.
I do indeed. Thanks, Peter. Well, first of all, I'm want to acknowledge we're on the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And for the last 6 years, I actually lived on the other side of the lake in West Kelowna, where we were actually on land that was leased from the Westbank First Nations. And candidly, they were an outstanding landlord. They were great people to deal with. And they were actually very concerned about environmental issues and other things. So it was interesting and a pleasure to work with them. I was asked today to speak on reaching a target of net zero for the grid by 2035. And I want to start out by saying I am very keen on renewables and clean energy. I'm also extremely committed to reaching net zero by 2050. But what even concerns me more is that we've got to get our emissions down, I believe, quickly in the next 5 to 10 years at the very most. So while this seems like an admirable target, to be perfectly honest with you, it's typical of a number of government choices which I think have been made with best intentions, but are not really very practical in nature. And I think of a number of these. One of them was, I remember some years ago, the government of Ontario went headlong into wind. And well, I think everybody agreed that was a good idea, but they didn't have the storage to go with it at the time, with the result. I know that I was in the control center one night at Clarkson, Ontario for the IESO and asked what they were doing with their surplus baseload. They said, watch, we're going to do it right now. They reduced capacity by 600 megawatts at Bruce Nuclear. And I said, I didn't know you could do that. Oh, they said, we can turn the generators down, but we can't turn the reactor down. So we're just turning the generator down. And I said, well, that's interesting. What are you doing with all the steam you make? And they said, well, that's a nasty little secret. We're discharging it all into Lake Huron. And that year they discharged 2-point-something million megawatt hours into Lake Huron, which I thought was basically almost a criminal act. We saw something similar happen in Alberta. The last government wanted to implement a capacity market. And when the new government was elected, they canceled it. And in my opinion, that actually led to some of the challenges we've had in the last month or two with very cold weather there, where Alberta was really in difficult states. So I think that setting a net zero target by 2035, and I'll explain this in detail, is actually a very bad idea, because I think what we need to be doing is doing everything we can quickly to reduce emissions wherever we can and to get the maximum emission reductions that we can by 2030 and not focus on the grid, because in actual fact, I think it's going to be very nearly impossible. But do you want to go to the next slide, please, for me? This is an example of what actually we saw happen in Alberta, but this is not, these numbers don't match the system in Alberta. But if you have a large fossil generation and you have wind and solar, a large wind and solar capacity, that's your total supply. And the provinces that are generating most of the emissions from the electric grid fall into the category where they don't have a lot of hydro, they don't have a lot of other sources. And in actual fact, in the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they don't really have a very strong interconnection capability to import power from other locations. So if you have a fossil fuel, for example, here of 50% capacity, and you're getting 50% of your wind and solar, 50% from wind and solar with some storage, you may have a serious problem. Batteries now in California have been shown to work very well for up to 4 to 5 hours. But if you try to do much more than that, the cost goes through the roof. Now, what happened in Calgary or in Alberta recently was they have about 5,000 odd megawatts of wind capacity. And with the cold weather that they had, we were under an atmospheric high pressure area that lasted a number of days. And when you're under a high pressure area, there's very little wind, little pressure gradient. So the wind is almost zero. And I looked a number of times at the the wind output in Alberta, and it was only 5 megawatts or 50 megawatts out of 5,000. And so if you don't have import capacity and you don't have enough fossil capacity to meet the demand, you're in serious trouble. And Alberta came very close to having to implement rolling blackouts at minus 30 degrees. And that would have been potentially a real disaster. The grid prices were sitting for a couple of days at $999.99 per megawatt hour, which is a horrendous price when you realize that the typical price is usually down between $50 and $100. So we have to deal with extreme weather events, and we have to understand what the impact of these are. Go to the next slide, please. Governments also want to ban natural gas. And I look at natural gas, and I know there are some serious problems with leakage at the source, which I'm led to believe by my friends from the oil industry that can be corrected, but they're expensive to correct, but they have to do it. We also have potential for new sources of energy, which are up to 20 years away. Added hydro, geothermal, which I actually think the geothermal option may be one that offers a lot of promise, and nuclear. But given the urgent need to reduce emissions quickly, what options exist? And I'm of the opinion that if we can use gas generation only for emergencies and peaks, that's probably the best opportunity that I can see. And if we do that, we're certainly not going to be down to net zero by 2035. Hybrid systems of gas and electric can reduce emissions by up to 80% with almost immediate results. So the problem I'm having is, why are we focused in the short term on extreme solutions where the emission target has to be zero? I believe that we need to focus on getting the maximum emission reduction we can get very quickly. And if we can do that by 2030, that would be terrific. And then we can spend the next 20 years driving that solution to zero. Next slide. Okay, storage costs. People just tell me that batteries will do the trick for everything. So I did a price estimate on 1,000 megawatts of storage for 96 hours, 4 days. And that's 96,000 megawatt hours with a battery cost of $75 a kilowatt hour, which is kind of midway where they are right now. The capital cost with the interface equipment on that is $8.3 billion. And if you use it for 3 cycles a year, which I was assuming you might use it for 1 full cycle, but if you use it for even 3, the cost of the storage, when you consider the life of the battery and the interest on money and the depreciation, is $3.42 a kilowatt hour, which nobody would accept. California has found recently that they can use battery storage to do 4 to 5 hours of storage. And this actually is working very well for them because with a capital cost of about $90 million, they can get 480 megawatt hours of storage. But then the cost of storage is about 3.4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is actually cheaper for them than remote hydro storage. And if you reduce the number of cycles and the amount of power you're storing, the price goes up reasonably quickly, but it peaks out at, by my calculation, at about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's a very reasonable number. And I'm saying battery storage works well in the short term, but if you can use it for multiple revenue streams, it's really quite profitable. But it's not effective for supply during extreme weather events that last several days. So we're going to have some other technology to deal with that. Next slide, please. Now this slide is the one that really disturbs me. The blue line on the graph shows Canada's emissions. And it doesn't include, by the way, it doesn't include wildfire emissions, which are more than double the ones shown. In the 1990s, we signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, which wanted to reduce our emissions to 6% below 1990 levels by 2012. And I remember calling a friend of mine who was working for Enercan. He was an assistant deputy minister responsible for the climate file. And I said, I'm surprised that we actually signed that agreement. And he said, you're no more surprised than I am. There was no budget, there was nothing done, and you can see the results were nothing. Then we signed the Paris Accord a few years later, and that was to get 17% below 25 emissions. And the emissions went up and down a little bit, but the big drop shortly after it was signed was caused by the financial meltdown, and the little drop that occurred a few years ago was caused by COVID. And more recently now, we signed an agreement in Glasgow saying we were going to get down 30% below the 2005 emission level by 2030. And each time as you look, the slope becomes a little steeper, and we're starting to see dramatic increases in weather. Now, one of the reasons is I'm old, but I remember 1965 quite well, and our atmospheric carbon currently is rising at 3 times the rate per year that it was rising in 1965. So we really need to take fast steps to drive that number down, because with the weather changes that we're seeing, if we don't, I think we're going to be in a near unlivable state by 2050. Net zero by 2050 is the point at which climate stops getting worse. And the target of 40% by 2030 will lower the level that we reach in 2050. So the time for action is now. And candidly, and I'm hearing this from others, Canada's performance is an international disgrace. We have a reputation now for setting aggressive targets with no action, and achieving rapid results is better than setting unreachable goals. Next slide. Now, this is a slide I got from a gentleman here at UBC that is doing studies on climate change and what it means. And if you look at the left graph, you'll see that the mean weather is shifting. We're getting more extreme hot weather and less extremely cold weather. We still will get extremely cold weather, as we've witnessed in the last few weeks, but the amount of warm weather is going up. And the graph at the right shows the warm records that are broken, and you can see it's accelerating rapidly and getting far, far worse. So we must have the capacity to meet extremes during extreme weather, and that's going to be a challenge. As you just heard in the past, we're going to have to increase our capacity dramatically in order to achieve success. And what actually frightens me is we spend about, well, in the US, they spend around 5% of their GDP per person on energy. But if you look at some of the poor countries in the world, they're spending 50% on energy. And if we double the price of energy, people in North America will complain, but it won't kill them. But in the poorer parts of the world, such as Africa and some parts of Asia, it's going to be devastating. Next slide, please. And so our electric grid right now is 60.2% hydro, 14.6% nuclear, 17.5 fossil, and 7.8% renewable. And that's the electric grid. The 7.8% renewable, you can divide that by 5 because the electric grid only provides less than 20% of the total emission of the total energy that we use. So taking that 7.8%, really the total renewable energy as a portion of our total energy use is down around 2%. And we can't install conventional large capacity generation or transmission in less than about 15 years. The next point is a really key one. Our grid was originally designed as a one-way system to generate power at a local central site and deliver it to customers. And we're in a state right now where we cannot actually connect a lot of distributed renewables to the distribution system. The transmission system was fixed in about 1940, but the distribution system, the protection on it is restricted. And so high penetration of distributed resources, which people just assume is not there. There's 70,000 US customers in the Southeast, basically, with solar capacity that are blocked from grid access because the protection system cannot identify faults. And in California, Pacific Gas and Electric has been turning off power distribution lines during hot and windy weather, claiming it's a fire hazard. And in fact, that's exactly what it is, because they can't see a fault from the substation, which is where the protection sits. And so the fault just continues to go and it starts a fire. Net zero tariffs are being downgraded or canceled, and because customers are actually expecting free storage from the utilities. Now, none of this is good news. Distributed rooftop solar may have huge potential, but we need to upgrade the protection system, which is not a small task, and we need to do much better distribution voltage management on the electric distribution grid. And these are not small problems. The question is, who's going to pay the added cost? Next slide. We're just about at the end here. Utilities are now abandoning net metering. If you look at the upper graph, that's the old duck curve in California that shows what rooftop solar has been doing. But if you look at the bottom graph, you can see that solar comes up in the morning and is quite a high level all day and then goes down in the late afternoon. But if you look at the grid price for power, the wholesale prices dropped to below negative, below zero. And in actual fact, companies like Hydro-Quebec, Manitoba, and BC Hydro are out there saying, we've got hydro storage and we can store that energy. So they're buying it at very, very low prices, only to sell it back after 6 o'clock when the price goes rocketing up. And so you can see that if a homeowner in California has rooftop solar that he's collecting a fixed price for, the utility may be losing money on it. And so we're seeing a problem here that really requires a cooperative approach between the utilities, customers, and I think we need a broad group of people to look at this. Next slide.
Is it? Yes. This is your last slide, I think, is it?
Yeah, this is the last
Okay,
one.
good.
So politicians have demonstrated to me that they're not equipped to make technical choices. Canada has shown political ambitions for climate, but no action or budget. What is needed, I think, is a small group of people with broad backgrounds. And I'm very pleased to see academic people and people from the universities attending this, because in fact, you're the group that really can play a major role in working with the customers and with the utilities. And I think that if we can get a group of people to work together and help the politicians, the concept should benefit everybody, the utilities, the customers, and the country. there's a lot at stake. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Now, I see that we've got some comments in the chat already. And let me just go and okay, so from Marius Bauer, I'm interested in heat batteries, something that is being used in Europe. There are some interesting tests going on. Geothermal is potential, very interesting, but the danger is that it could affect groundwater. Anybody want to comment on? I'm not sure what a heat battery is. This like a maybe maybe you're thinking about a wax paraffin or something, heating up a salt or a paraffin wax and using that as a storage medium. Is that, Marius? Is that what you're talking about?
No, there is a series of an interesting projects. There's one in Finland where the sand of the sand filters of a wastewater treatment plant is being dumped in a big tank, and solar and wind energy is heating up that tank. And there's a coil in it where water runs through, and that means it basically heats a large of the surrounding area. So the house,
district energy plan. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anybody want to comment on that? And I see you got a, yeah. Okay, you've got a link to the battery. Okay.
I've looked at a number of these, and candidly, I suspect that there's a lot of connections, a lot of stuff that's coming that may have really good potential, and that may be one of them. I've information on that out of the UK, but I was not aware of the one in Finland. But these are the sorts of things that we need. We need innovation.
Good. All right, I've got a few questions here. Let me go through. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Lee asks, given that the electrical grid is only provides 5% of the needed power, what role might hydrogen play in this situation, e.g. heating, transportation? What is the most viable application, and how much of the solution will hydrogen provide? I'm not sure, Lee, whether you meant the electrical grid only provides 5% of the needed power.
That was a comment
It's
by
close to
Malcolm.
20.
That was a comment by Malcolm. But anyway, it's not the whole percentage. There's a very large chunk of the energy that's not provided by the grid. So that was where it came from. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
My number was between 15 and 20%.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, so that's fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the role of hydrogen, Jay, any thoughts on that?
But hydrogen's really interesting. I think more has to happen. I know a lot of our members are looking at the ways that they can use it. So I think interestingly, if it gets cheaper, then I think it gets a lot more useful. I think right now it's if technology it doesn't improve a great deal, if we don't get really good economies of scale, I think it's something that you would want to use. Everything we're using hydrogen for today, you can do that with electricity instead, right? You can generate electricity with electricity instead of using steam methane reformation of natural gas. So that's a win. We should be doing that. I think using hydrogen as an energy storage medium itself, we've got some challenges there, but I know some of our members are working on really interesting things where they can generate hydrogen in the short term and use it to cut down their peak power generation, natural gas consumption using hydrogen instead. So it's a trade-off, right? Hydrogen is an energy intensive molecule. It's leaky. It's kind of a pain. It's because it's so small, it's corrosive, it's reactive, it's explosive, it's all those things. So but there are some interesting applications of it. I think there's going to be some, where we're looking at today is things that are really hard to electrify directly. And hydrogen is probably something that is an option there, right? So
just add I know a lot of the work that people are looking at in terms of transportation. One of the alternatives that is becoming more and more popular is putting the hydrogen into ammonia, which is easier to ship than liquid or gaseous hydrogen, and then you reform it at the other end and strip the hydrogen, which is not hard to do. So that's great. We've also got a note from Marius again. I know that in the Netherlands, hydrogen is being used by some public transportation companies. There are also tests going to have heavy equipment run on trucks and elevators and excavators. All right, Charles, I've read that to green the existing hydrogen supply for coal and ag would take all the renewable the world currently has operating. Anybody gonna comment on that one?
I'd make one comment on that, Peter. If you make hydrogen using electrolysis, it's about 75% efficient. And so you're taking electricity and making hydrogen. There's a plant being built right now in Alberta that takes natural gas, and it doesn't do steam reformation. It releases hydrogen and produces carbon black, which is a very different process. And in fact, if those processes expand and are cost effective, they may give hydrogen a better life. I don't personally see hydrogen as something in vehicles, and I'm seeing articles that suggest they're going to blend it with natural gas for heating and biofuel, which will get the carbon footprint down of the gas, which may in fact be a very good idea. But the problem is the heat value of hydrogen is significantly less than natural gas. And so the pipelines may not have the capacity to deliver the amount of energy unless they're upgraded or the pressure is increased. So there's some
Enbridge
pluses and
Gas here in
minuses.
Ontario, the gas distribution company in Southern Ontario or in Ontario, mixes a bit of hydrogen. There's limits, and as Jay said, hydrogen is a small molecule, and if you just can't use an older natural gas pipeline and just put hydrogen into it. It would there'd be concerns about leakage. You may need a new type of line or some sort of a insert to make it more less reactive. Okay, Stephen has added a link to a thermal battery comment on as a industrial thermal battery report. So thank you for that. That's great. Let me just scroll down here. So Kevin saying, I'm a fan of the hydrogen ladder. It shows where the best opportunities for hydrogen are, and I find it hard to argue with. So he's put a linked into a hydrogen ladder. Thank you very much. So that's some sort of it looks like, Kevin, some priority, and I think as Jay mentioned, there may be applications in where you can't use electricity or batteries don't work. So I presume that's as part of that that ladder. So thank you. Marius, again, there's a project in the Netherlands where a wastewater treatment plant with bioreactor creates electricity used to make hydrogen that the neighboring bus company is buying to run their buses. Okay, well, getting a lot of comments here. I think that's the end of the comments I see. Anybody want to put up their hand and make a verbal comment or add another thought? Here we go. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Godeman. Hi, Malcolm. I wanted your thoughts on the viability of virtual power plants being one of the solutions during extreme weather scenarios. There you go. Malcolm, virtual power plants.
Well, actually, that's a very, very good point. Our grid right now is designed based on meeting the peak load that occurs for 15 minutes once a year. The average load on the grid is half of that. Yeah. So in actual fact, we have the ability to deliver twice as much energy as we're delivering, but we can't exceed the existing peak. And so by virtual power plant, you're basically using likely demand devices to manage the demand, and you can use it for balancing the grid and doing a whole list of other things. We have the company I started has a lot of experience doing that, and actually it's a very, very good thing to do. But what it will do is, if we can get enough supply, it'll allow us to deliver almost double the energy through the existing grid.
Yeah. Jay, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. From the opportunity is huge, right? As Malcolm said, there's a lot we can do there, and I think for the cheapest. This has been true for forever. The cheapest megawatt is the negawatt, right? Is the energy you don't consume. So starting from how do we reduce the amount of power that our homes, businesses, and industry consume on a daily basis, and especially if we're going to be transitioning from fossil fuel energy into electricity energy, every step we can take to defer an investment is good. If we can put off upgrading the pole top transformer that is on your street, or the pad mount that is at the substation that serves your neighborhood, if we can put that off by 5 years, 10 years, that adds up extraordinarily quickly. Put that on top of you just can't find transformers the way that we used to be able to do. The wait time for those have gone from about 12 months to 3 to even 7 years to be able to get a new transformer. So it's not even just it's a good idea, it's we have to. So homes, businesses, transportation, they all have to be much more efficient. And then adding on top of that is there a way where you can increase the resilience of it? If you have a home that's very well insulated, you're automatically in better shape if you lose your power, or your heating or cooling is interrupted, right? You're going to maintain a steady state for longer than if you have a leakier home. So those kinds of things, it's a safety matter. It makes business sense. It's better, and you're more comfortable too, right? It's a more comfortable environment to be in. So.
And for people who are interested in the concept of the virtual power plant, I think first came to prominence with a guy named Amory Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute. His book was called Soft Energy Paths, and he was talking about this concept in the 70s. So it's been around, and certainly Malcolm is a Canadian leader with the work he did at Enbala with that concept. Okay, we've got a few more questions. So let me just go to this one from Charles. Is it realistic to focus on developing behind-the-meter renewable capacity for industrial loads with BESS? It seems the biggest holdback there is provincial regulations. Perhaps I'm missing something. Any thoughts?
Can we have an explainer on BESS, or just a breakout of what that acronym is?
Charles, maybe you could unmute yourself and tell us a little bit more. I'm not sure what you mean by BESS either.
Battery energy storage systems.
Okay.
Battery energy storage system. Okay, great.
Yeah.
I
Hi,
can make.
Charles,
Oh, go
can you
ahead.
hear me?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
You know, an example of that is I'm looking at a situation in Ontario. Canadian Nickel, I think they're called, are putting in a new nickel processing facility in the Timmins area. And to me, based on a couple of scenarios I've looked at, it seems to make sense to set up a solar facility or other renewables generating facilities to supply the new net load that they have, or at least a base portion of that. But you know, and in behind the meter situation, so you don't have to worry about tie-ins with the grid and grid capacity and all of those sort of bottlenecks. But then, you know, what's preventing that from happening is that currently the Ontario government is, to the best of my knowledge, is not allowing that type of scenario. May change in the near future. Hopefully it does. But I guess my question is, you know, is there something other than the regulatory aspect of that I'm missing why that would not make sense?
I'll add something to that. I think, first of all, putting in a battery and using the battery to supply the intermittency of that is great. The only problem is what happens if you get 3 or 4 cloudy days in a row and you're counting on the power. It's not going to be there. But on the other side of the coin, to go back to the virtual power plant operation, the one thing that does do for you is it would allow you to actually support grid voltage. And if you do that, you can reduce loss and you can deliver more power. And it was raised before that if we could defer upgrades by a year, 2 years, 3 years, there's very large saving for the utility in doing that. And I'm of the opinion that if you do that sort of thing, they should be prepared to pay the customer for the support they provide.
Yeah, I'll just add, I'm Charles, I'm in Ontario. And one of the companies I worked with is a company called Peak Power. They weren't generating from renewables. They were for large industries. They were having what was a very large battery pack in effect, and they were taking advantage of the different prices in electricity and also guaranteeing power quality. This, you know, as with a lot of industry, power quality is a really critical issue. So now they've run into some issues, but there are some companies that provide this. I don't believe they needed the Ontario Energy Board. The regulator did not get involved with that because they're not a generator. It was a behind the meter energy battery storage system. But we are going to have to close here. If you've got other questions, we can certainly. And thank you. Guneman sent a reference to the RMI study, so thank you very much. And so I'll read one more comment here, I guess, from Steph. Separate from BC Center for Innovation and Clean Energy, CICE, globally the jurisdictions that have the that have the highest penetration of variable renewable energy, greater than 40%, are starting to experience a shift in their peak loads from summer to winter. As winter loads are longer than summer, it means that more future grid will need much more storage and higher duration, 6 to 8 hours plus. Would appreciate your thoughts on this. Really good question. I don't think we've got time for that question, but anybody who's interested, and I know there's some companies online here that have some storage technologies. Maybe you want to get back in touch with. It looks like SEP, and you can see it in the chat box from the BC Center for Innovation. So maybe I'll just ask both, and we started with Jay, so I'll end with I'll start with Malcolm. Just any final words to our audience today, Malcolm, on net zero 2030 and reducing our carbon challenge.
Well, as I think I said, I don't support the net zero by 2035. I think what we need to do is focus on getting total emissions down as fast as we can. And in order to do that, I think we need to initiate some sort of a cooperative arrangement between government and multi-sectors, technical, academic, and others, and even some students to discuss and produce recommendations.
Okay, good. And Jay, final comment?
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks very much for having us and you know, in putting this discussion together. You know, final comment, Malcolm, if you know, if you're looking to work for a national trade association in Ottawa, give me a call. I like what I loved your presentation, I think is the short answer on that. So, and I think, yeah, I'll just end with agreement on that. I think there are gains that we can make. And goals can be, you know, it can provide a vision and a quick way for us to sort of get our head around, you know, we're all moving in a direction. That's great, right? Net zero by 2035 or 50. It sounds like something that is a good thing that we can move towards, right? But when it comes down to it, it is about getting carbon, you know, carbon dioxide molecules out of the atmosphere faster than they are entering it. And that is it. That is the whole game. So that's where we need to be focused, and we need to just keep moving forward on that. There's things we can do, and it's an exciting time. So thank you.
Thank you both. Aditi, over to you. Any final words of wisdom?
Not really. Great session. Thank you, Malcolm and Jay, and Peter for kind of moderating. One last word on our next Climate Connections event. That would be on the Bio edition on March 12th. So feel free to register for this event. And thank you all for joining in. We would be sending links to Malcolm's and Jay's LinkedIn page. So if you have any further discussions, feel free to connect with them and get this conversation going.